Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about something that doesn't just defy the laws of the Imperium, it shreds the very fabric of reality. I'm talking about the Void Tongue. This isn't just some ancient dialect or a corrupted variant of High Gothic whispered by madmen in the dark. No, this is something older, darker, and far more dangerous. The Void Tongue is a language that shouldn't exist, because when it does exist, reality begins to unravel. There are whispers, of course. Whispers that even mentioning its structure can bend thought. That reading it, even silently, can fracture a mind beyond repair. It's the kind of language that was never meant to be spoken by human tongues. In fact, many believe it wasn't made by anything that could be called alive. Some claim it's a fragment of the warp itself, condensed into syllables. Others think it's the echo of something long dead and best forgotten. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain, it's forbidden. By decree, by necessity, by the very logic of survival. This language isn't forbidden because the ecclesiarchy fears heresy. It's forbidden because it works. It opens doors that were never meant to be opened. When spoken aloud, it doesn't just sound wrong, it is wrong. The air thickens, the shadows twitch, the world forgets what it was supposed to be. Words have power in the grimdark, sure, but the Void Tongue, it's a weapon. A mimetic, cognitive, psionic infection that turns knowledge into a plague. And here's the kicker. No one truly understands it. Not fully. Not even the cults that devote themselves to it. At best, they parrot fragments and scrape against the surface of something that might not even be a language in the way we understand it. It's like trying to explain color to someone born blind, except the moment you succeed, they go insane. The moment you comprehend the Void Tongue, it's already too late. So why do people seek it out? Why risk madness, damnation, and worse? Because there's power in it. Raw, absolute, unfiltered power. The kind of power that doesn't just rewrite laws of physics, it deletes them. And in a galaxy where survival often means bending the rules, some are willing to gamble everything on a tongue that tears at the seams of existence itself. Let's peel back the layers. Let's look into the origin, the structure, the spread, and the fanatical devotion surrounding this language of unmaking. If you think High Gothic and Technolingua are dangerous, you haven't heard anything yet. Let's take a step back. Before the cults, before the Inquisition started burning entire hive blocks just to silence a single syllable, before the Mechanicus started locking data vaults under miles of adamantium, where did the Void Tongue come from? That's the big question. And the truth is, we don't really know. We have guesses, we have fragments, but that's part of the horror, isn't it? That something so dangerous, so corrosive to reality itself, might not even have a traceable origin. Some fans think it predates even the war in heaven. That's right, before the Necrontire turned into soulless machines, before the old ones played God with genomes and webways, there were already echoes of this thing. Not words, exactly, but ideas. Concepts so incompatible with the materium that they could only exist as raw warp resonance. And when the old ones started creating psychic races, Eldar, Krorks, even proto-humans, they might have accidentally tapped into something they couldn't contain, something that listened back. Maybe that's when the first syllables were born. There's one theory I love because it's as chilling as it is beautiful. The Void Tongue isn't a language that was made. It was found, a fossil, encoded in the warp itself, like a memory of the universe's first scream. Some say the first to utter it wasn't even alive, that it was whispered by a dying star, or that it bled out of the mind of a being as it was consumed by the immaterium. Others say it came from a far distant galaxy, a kind of echo bouncing through the warp that finally found receptive ears in our own. It's such a terrifying thought, that it's not from here at all. That it's an infection drifting between galaxies, waiting for something to hear it. Of course, if you look into human records, what few remain, you'll find strange mentions of early psychers during the dark age of technology, speaking in tongues that drove entire ships mad. Some scrap logs from Mars mention utterances that melt logic cores and sound strings incompatible with binary sequence recognition. That last one's especially creepy, because it implies machines understood something, even for a second, before burning out. Imagine that, a cogitator dying of comprehension. And then there's Malix. Not everyone talks about him because there's so little confirmed data, but those who dig deep into Rogue Mechanicus lore know the name. Some claim he was a Magos during the Age of Strife, others say he was never human at all, some fusion of man, demon, and code. But supposedly he didn't just speak Void tongue. He wrote it on reality itself, carved it into the hulls of ships that disappeared into the warp and never returned. Or worse, did return, but not as they left, just wrong. Off by degrees, not quite synced with the rest of the universe anymore. There are even murals, deep in the no-light zones of dead Forge worlds, that show beings with mouths sewn shut, bleeding symbols instead of speech. These figures are surrounded by watchers, some recognizably human, some clearly not, recording the bloody characters with reverent awe. What were they recording? And who taught those figures to bleed language in the first place? Some fans also point to the xenolinguist orders from pre-Imperial Terra, especially during the final centuries of Old Earth's fragmentation. They were obsessed with non-human grammar structures, and a few allegedly went mad after deciphering parts of a Necron transmission. Now, most people would laugh that off, but think about it. Necrons don't use sound the way we do. If they were encoding Void tongue into technomantic pulse patterns, who's to say someone didn't hear the wrong thing at the wrong time? I personally lean toward the theory that it was never meant for us, that it's not even a language in the human sense, but a structure, a framework used by something far beyond us. Maybe it wasn't even meant to communicate. Maybe it's a kind of linguistic parasite that became language once minds interacted with it, and that's why no one remembers who created it. Because it's older than creation. Or maybe it is creation, inverted. The horror of it is that we don't even know if it had a beginning. Maybe it's just always been there, like background radiation in the warp. And the moment the first mind stumbled into its pattern, be it an old one, a corrupted psyker, or something else, it set off a chain reaction that's still unraveling across the stars. A linguistic event horizon. And now, it's still spreading. Hidden in texts, echoed in the minds of madmen. Tucked away in forbidden archives and psychically encoded sigils, it waits. Because the Void tongue doesn't need a speaker. It just needs a listener. One of the weirdest and most terrifying things about the Void tongue is that it doesn't behave like any language we know. And I'm not just talking about syntax or phonetics. I mean, it breaks the way we understand communication altogether. It's not just hard to translate, it actively resists it. Like it's aware of being dissected, like it doesn't want to be known. And when you try to grasp it, it grasps you back. People always ask, why can't the Lex mechanics just run it through their cogitators? Why not use machine translation like they do for Xenos languages? But that's the thing. They've tried. Hundreds of times. Every time the result is either corrupted data, spontaneous code loops, or worse, temporary sentience in the machine, followed by total meltdown. There's this infamous case from a Mechanicus listening post on Scholar Prime. They intercepted a repeating signal from deep space, thought it was some form of encoded trade code, and started running it through their parsing engine. What came out was a screaming feedback loop that fried the minds of everyone connected to the network. The engine recorded one phrase before burning out, syntax complete, object realigned. Now, if that doesn't send shivers down your spine, you don't get it. Because it means the language didn't just communicate, it changed something. See, normal language is symbolic. It points to things. A word means something, but it isn't the thing itself. The Void tongue doesn't work like that. Every syllable is both symbol and function. You don't describe fire, you ignite it. You don't mention entropy, you invoke it. And that's why translation fails, because there's nothing to map. You can't decode it without enacting it. Some fans compare it to a linguistic virus. Not just a pattern of sound, but a self-replicating structure that uses understanding as a vector. The moment your brain starts to decode its meaning, it begins rewriting how you process concepts. It doesn't just change your thoughts, it changes the structure of your thinking. I once read a theory that Void tongue doesn't operate on semantics or grammar, but on ontological resonance. That is, it doesn't communicate facts, it communicates being. That would explain a lot. Why exposure causes madness. Why listeners report feeling like their thoughts no longer belong to them. Why some who try to read transcribed fragments lose the ability to perceive time linearly. There was this poor soul, an Ordo-Xenos linguist who supposedly cracked a partial sentence. He didn't speak afterward. He just started drawing circles on every surface he could find, repeating one phrase again and again. Meaning is the illusion that hides the mechanism. And look, I get it. That sounds like melodramatic heresy. But if you really dive into the data fragments, the redacted Inquisition logs, the scrap notes left behind by rogue tech priests, it all paints the same picture. The void tongue is incompatible with baseline cognition. Not difficult. Incompatible. Like trying to run a warp echo through an Imperial voxcaster, it doesn't distort. It annihilates. Another angle I've seen fans debate is whether the void tongue is actually spoken at all. There's this school of thought that says the phonetic sounds are just shadows, that the real language exists in a non-linear waveform across psychic and quantum dimensions, and what we call speech is just a crumbling echo of the original signal. It would explain why attempts to record it often result in audiovisual corruption or sudden entropy spikes in localized machine spirits. And yet somehow, it still feels like language. People who've survived hearing it always describe the same thing, a sense of understanding, followed instantly by terror. Not because they heard something scary, but because they knew something they shouldn't. It's like it bypasses reason and just installs truth directly into the soul, except it's a kind of truth that human minds can't metabolize. There's even this theory that the void tongue wasn't built for speech at all, that it's a kind of programming language, but for reality itself. Like ancient runes from the dark age of technology that weren't just labels, but actual executable commands encoded into space-time. If that's true, then every utterance is a command line, and every failed translation is a misfire of power we can't control. You hear rumors in Mechanicus black vaults of ghost code, language fragments that write themselves when no one's watching. Pieces of void tongue appearing in broken logs, cursed data slates, or recorded only by devices that should have been dead for centuries. They call it the echo bleed, and while most dismiss it as corrupted memory, some say it's the language trying to reassemble itself. That's the scariest part, honestly. That void tongue wants to be spoken again, not by individuals, not even by cults, but by reality itself, like a recursive loop we accidentally activated, and now it's slowly rebooting the syntax of the universe. And if it ever finishes the sentence, who knows if we'll still be here to understand what it meant. If you start tracing the twisted footprints of the void tongue, you inevitably stumble upon the cults, the ones who didn't just hear fragments, but embraced them. Not many records survive about who first used the void tongue in any organized way. And honestly, that makes sense. These weren't organizations built to last. They were outbreaks of obsession, contagions of thought that tore through minds like wildfire. But still, there are names. Half erased from history, whispered in archives so heavily redacted, they're more black than ink. A lot of fans argue that the earliest true cults sprang up in the dark corners of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Not the open, candlelit basilica forges of Mars, but the forgotten research zones, dead orbitals, subcrustal labs, entire moons gone silent, and later purged from star charts. It's not surprising. The Mechanicus have always had a hunger for forbidden knowledge, especially during the dark age of technology and its chaotic aftermath. Some say there was an offshoot sect, maybe from the time before Mars was fully brought into the Imperium, that believed reality itself was just poorly optimized code. They weren't heretics back then, just visionaries. They wanted to patch the universe. And when they found fragments of the void tongue encoded in broken data archives, they thought they'd found the keys to the machine spirit of existence. One log fragment, supposedly intercepted during a deep scrape of a quarantine Mechanicus vault, simply read, "The syllable is the command, the tongue is the machine, the mind is the interface." That line still gives me chills. Because if true, it suggests they weren't just speaking void tongue, they were building with it. Engineering structures, rerouting energy, even creating synthetic life patterns, all powered through linguistic invocations, tech chant as spellcasting. But instead of praying to the Omnissiah, they were whispering directly into the bones of reality. Another theory, and honestly one I find even more terrifying, is that the very first void tongue cult wasn't human at all. That we didn't discover it, we caught it. There are scattered references to encounters with xenocults on dead worlds, their ruins carved in impossible geometries, their chants encoded in sonic frequencies that don't make sense until you dream about them. Could be pre-Eldar, or maybe even something that predates the war in heaven. Some of those theories even suggest that the Eldar themselves once dabbled in void tongue before their fall, and that some fragment of it survives deep within the Black Library, locked away so tightly that even the Harlequins refuse to speak of it. But back in the human sphere, during the Age of Strife, things got really chaotic. Isolated void stations and warp-touched planets became perfect breeding grounds for what would later be classified as proto-cults. One of the most notorious is the Echo Choir of the Hollow Psalm. Creepy name, I know, and we don't have a lot of hard data on them, but what we do have is bone-chilling. They operated in total silence, no audible chanting, no written scriptures, just psychic projection. Supposedly, they communicated entirely in void tongue through shared mental resonance. Entire planetary populations were converted in days, not through persuasion, but through exposure. And when they were finally purged, all that remained were empty cities with strange sigils etched into the teeth of the dead. And then, of course, there are the chaos cults. Once the warp got involved, the whole thing exploded into madness. Nurgle had the Rot Tongue sects, who believed that the Void Tongue was the voice of decay itself. Tzeentch had entire cabals of changelings who spoke only in paradoxes, convinced that the Void Tongue was the blueprint of destiny, rewritten in real time. Even Khorne got in on the action, strangely enough. One warband, the Crimson Oath, was known for screaming untranslated void phrases in battle, believing each phrase was a key that would unlock a true death in the warp. And then there are the rogue psychers. This might be the most tragic branch of all, because a lot of these weren't even trying to be cultists. They were just people, isolated, scared, overwhelmed by their powers, who stumbled onto fragments of void tongue while scrabbling for control. And once they tasted it, once they understood a single word, it was over. Not in the dramatic explode in a warp storm kind of way. More like a slow, inevitable erosion. Their personalities dissolved, their memories blurred, their thoughts started fracturing into recursive loops. Eventually, they stopped speaking anything else. Their minds, completely rewritten by the syntax of a reality that didn't care about causality or time or self. The most famous rogue psyker tied to this phenomenon is called Ilvar Reth. He wasn't part of any known order, just a drifter with a growing cult in his wake. They say he never spoke above a whisper, but people still heard him, inside their heads, in their dreams, sometimes even in their bones. And every time he spoke, something nearby would break. Not physically, conceptually. Walls would become passageways, fires would freeze, names would vanish from memory. Eventually his followers weren't even human anymore, just reflections of his voice. It's crazy to think about, but what unites all these first cults, Mechanicus heretics, xenocryptic echo psalms, chaos worshippers, and broken psychers, isn't ideology. It's desperation. They weren't just trying to gain power. They were trying to understand something bigger than themselves, something they thought could save them or elevate them or give them control in a universe that's pure screaming entropy. But instead of control, they found a mirror. And the void tongue doesn't reflect what you are. It shows you what you were never meant to become. Here's the part that really messes with your head. Void tongue doesn't just hurt to hear. It does things. Actual, tangible, impossible things. We're not talking about metaphorical influence or spiritual symbolism. This isn't your usual heretical scripture that corrupts the soul through ideology. No, this is a language that literally distorts reality just by being spoken. The words aren't just descriptors. They are catalysts, triggers, some kind of programming code laced into the bones of the materium and the warp alike. And every time someone speaks a phrase, they aren't just communicating, they're rewriting the rules. There are reports, scattered and sketchy as always, about rooms changing shape when void tongue is uttered. I don't mean some kind of psychic hallucination. I mean the architecture itself shifting. One account from a burned-out Inquisition node tells of a heretic cell discovered in an Underhive temple. When the acolytes burst in, the cultist leader screamed a phrase that translated roughly as unbinding of the threshold, and a solid adamantium wall opened into empty sky. They were thousands of meters underground. The whole team was lost to freefall. The Vox logs cut out mid-scream. Then there are the temperature anomalies, multiple cases of spontaneous combustion, freezing, time slippage, all tied to vocalizations of void tongue phrases. And what's most terrifying is that these effects seem to have no consistency. One phrase might collapse a wall in one location, but cause a person's skeleton to invert in another. The same word doesn't always produce the same effect. It's almost like the language reads the context, or maybe the speaker, and reacts accordingly. Like it's alive, reactive, adaptive. Some fans believe that void tongue functions as a kind of inverse reality field. Instead of reinforcing the laws of physics the way most structured speech does, like in technolingua or ritual cant, it actively corrodes them. It doesn't explain the world, it breaks it open. That would explain why areas heavily contaminated with void speech residue tend to exhibit persistent warp fluctuations. The local laws of gravity get a little fuzzy. Electromagnetic fields behave like they're drunk. Even perception itself begins to warp. People forget their own names or start seeing events that haven't happened yet. Or worse, that can't happen because the causality just doesn't line up anymore. One of the wildest theories I've read, and I kind of believe it, suggests that void tongue is the auditory form of what the Eldar call a thin place. A zone where reality is stretched so taut that the warp begins to bleed through. It doesn't create the thinness, it reveals it. Like the words don't cast spells, they just uncover the cracks that were always there. And when those cracks get exposed, things start to slip through. Things with claws, things that whisper back. What really pushes this idea into nightmare territory is the phenomenon of latent psychic awakening. There are documented cases, yes, documented by Ordo Hereticus operatives, of baseline humans who were exposed to void tongue not only going mad, but developing psychic abilities almost instantly. Not subtle stuff either. Full-on warp surges, bleeding eyes, levitation, spontaneous bilocation. In one infamous case, a sanitation worker on High Vulentis heard a phrase broadcast over a hijacked Vox channel. 3 days later, he melted through the floor of his HAB unit, leaving behind only ash and a repeating psychic echo that fried every psyker in a 5-block radius. Some believe void tongue acts like a beacon or amplifier for the warp. That even if you're not psychic, the language can force you to become a conduit. Not because it awakens potential, but because it forcibly hollows you out. It burns through your soul and leaves a tunnel behind, a clean channel straight into the immaterium. And the warp, being what it is, doesn't like to be invited in without a gift. So it takes something. Your mind, usually, or your shape, or your timeline. Others argue the language itself is made of warp stuff, that it's not actually sound at all, but psychic waveform pretending to be phonetics. When spoken aloud, it doesn't resonate in air. It resonates in reality's structure, like screaming into a cracked mirror and watching the world fracture in reflection. That's why you don't even need to hear it directly. Sometimes just being near someone who's thinking in void tongue is enough. There are stories of entire strike teams collapsing with aneurysms after storming a cultist enclave, only to find that no one was speaking, just thinking, just remembering. The old phrase says, knowledge is power, but in this case, knowledge is a loaded weapon with a hair trigger and no safety. Just knowing the structure of certain void phrases can make reality twitch. Like the universe itself is flinching. And the scariest part? We have no idea what the limits are. What's the void tongue equivalent of a shout, of a scream, of a song? Because if a whispered word can unravel the floor beneath your feet, what happens when an entire cult sings in unison? Not a metaphorical hymn, a true song. One that resonates across space and thought and soul. Some say that's how entire planets have vanished without a trace. Not exterminatus, not warp storms, just a single perfect chorus. A phrase spoken in harmony, and the world simply ceased. That's the power of this language. It doesn't tell stories, it becomes them, and the ending is always the same. Silence. There's a theory I keep coming back to, no matter how many times I try to push it aside. It's the kind of idea that doesn't sit comfortably in your head, like a splinter behind your eye. It goes like this. The void tongue isn't just connected to the warp, it is the warp. Or maybe more precisely, it's the structure of the warp, trying to express itself in a way we can almost, but never quite, comprehend. It's not such a crazy leap when you think about it. The warp isn't just a sea of emotions or raw psychic force. It has structure. Not our kind of structure, not atoms and gravity and space, but a kind of shape made out of thought, emotion, and intention. A metaphysical geometry where concepts have weight and time flows like a dream. What if the void tongue is just that structure, rendered into a form that can almost slip through the cracks into our reality? Not a translation, not an imitation, a direct echo. Like the warp bleeding syllables into the materium. This might be why the void tongue feels so incompatible with everything we know. It's not just foreign. It was never meant for this side of the veil. Its grammar doesn't follow logic because logic is a mortal invention. In the warp, everything is both true and false at the same time. Identity is a suggestion. Distance is emotional. Time is a spiral that doesn't know where it began. If you tried to build a language to function in that place, it would look insane to us. And if you tried to speak that language here, well, we've seen what happens. Some fans call void tongue the syntax of madness, but I think that undersells it. Madness implies a break from truth. But what if void tongue is actually too true? What if it reveals things that our minds aren't wired to accept? That's why so many who hear even a single phrase report that gut punch sense of recognition. Like they're hearing something they already knew, buried deep in some psychic ancestry that predates civilization, language, maybe even biology. Like the soul has heard this voice before, not in this life or any life, but in the raw shape of its potential. There's also this idea, floating around some of the more obscure data nets, that the void tongue isn't just spoken through the warp. It might be the very tool the warp uses to shape the galaxy. Like when a psyker channels power, they're not just pulling raw energy, they're invoking reality through some primordial syntax that's older than time. And every manifestation of warp phenomena, from demonic possession to precognition, might actually be the result of unconscious utterances of void structures. Not speech in the traditional sense, just resonance. Thought that trembles at the same frequency. I once read a fragment of a Magos report from a doomed expedition into the Eye of Terror. It was mostly static and blood smears, but one part stuck with me. It said, "We no longer think, the warp thinks us. The language dreams and we unfold." That's such a perfect summary of what the void tongue feels like. It's not about control, it's about surrender. About being spoken by the warp instead of speaking to it. There's a chilling implication here, and some fans have leaned into it hard. What if the void tongue isn't something we discovered at all? What if it's a failsafe? A backdoor code planted into the galaxy by the warp itself? A method by which it can manifest, adjust, rewrite. Every time someone uses it, it's not them doing something, it's the warp using them to push one more step into our realm. Like a software update sneaking in through corrupted prayers. And yeah, that ties in with a whole range of living warp theories. The ones that suggest the warp isn't just reactive or sentient in bursts, but fully aware. Not as a god, not even as a being, but as a total omnidirectional intelligence that spans emotional spectra instead of neural patterns. In that framework, void tongue becomes a kind of neural output, like a mind exhaling its thoughts into the physical realm. A thought from the warp, spoken in mortal space. It also explains why daemons sometimes speak it, and why their voices sound wrong even when they use human words. The real voice isn't the noise, it's the shape of the effect it has on reality. Like a song that shatters glass, even if you can't hear the note. And what if the reason we can never fully translate it is because we are the wrong interface? That we're trying to read a waveform with a meat-based operating system that's blind to its source code. But psychers, especially unsanctioned ones, get close, because their minds are already halfway inside the warp. And sometimes, when the veil thins, they don't just tap into power, they speak back in a voice they didn't know they had. There's a story, no idea if it's true, but it's floated around the Librarius circles for years, about a sanctioned psyker on Cadia who during a Black Crusade was heard shouting a phrase in a language no one recognized. The ground cracked. Daemons halted mid-charge and turned around. The guard unit survived, but the psyker didn't. He evaporated. Literally just vanished, mid-word. No scorch mark, no warp residue, just gone. Like he'd spoken the one sentence that the warp couldn't bear to hear. Or maybe one it needed to hear, to move on to the next phase. What does that mean for us? I don't know. Maybe the void tongue isn't something to fight against. Maybe it's not a weapon, maybe it's a warning, or maybe it's a key. The question is, to what? And are we already turning the lock? This is where things start to get truly disturbing. Not just in a cosmic, existential horror kind of way, but in a very real, very nowhere is safe kind of way. We've talked about how the void tongue twists reality, how it reshapes physics and bleeds into the warp, but what really keeps me up at night is this. It spreads like a virus. A cognitive contagion. A mimetic plague that doesn't care about flesh or firepower. It doesn't need to be spoken by a cultist or chanted in a ritual. Sometimes, all it takes is hearing it, or worse, understanding it. There's this term thrown around by certain Ordo Hereticus scholars, informational weaponization. Sounds cold, clinical, but it means something horrifying. A string of data, words, sounds, even a pattern of light or a sequence of symbols that, when perceived by the human brain, triggers something. Not metaphorically, literally, something chemical, psychic, or even structural. And the void tongue? It might be the most refined form of that weapon we've ever encountered. The earliest case I came across was buried in a transcript of a destroyed black ship report. A sanctioned psyker exposed to a fragment of void tongue scribbled on a scrap of cloth in a captured heretic's cell. He didn't even read it, just brushed his fingers over the sigils and said he felt the shape of the words. An hour later, he was speaking in reversed syllables that cracked the plasteel floor beneath him. 3 crew members tried to restrain him. One clawed her own eyes out. One aged 90 years in under a minute. The third survived, but now dreams exclusively in a language no one can decode, not even cogitators. That's not an isolated event. The void tongue doesn't care about physical barriers. It doesn't respect logic or distance. There are Vox recordings sealed in stasis by the Inquisition because just playing them on an unsecured channel caused minor warp bleed events. In one tragic case on Carthus Station, a tech adept unknowingly played a recovered signal believed to be corrupted binary. Turns out it wasn't binary. It was a void tongue chant compressed into code. The moment it played, every servo skull within 100 meters simultaneously malfunctioned and began screaming. Not static, screaming. After that, the inhabitants of the station started reporting the same dream. A mouth made of mirrors. Words that tasted like metal. A song that didn't end. By the time the Inquisition arrived, the station was silent. Everyone was alive, technically, but none of them remembered who they were. Names, faces, even the concept of individuality had just unraveled. The population now operated in complete synchronicity, repeating the same tasks, finishing each other's sentences, perfectly cooperative, emotionless, and every now and then they'd all pause and whisper a phrase no one could record. That's what void tongue does when it gets into a population. It's not a flame, it's not even a scream, it's infiltration. It moves through data, through memory, through imitation. You don't even have to understand it consciously, it just needs exposure. One symbol drawn in dust, one humming syllable carried on a vox wave, one child repeating something they heard in a dream. That's enough. And the thing is, even destruction doesn't seem to stop it. There are reports of entire vaults being cleansed, text destroyed, recordings purged, speakers executed, and yet the phrase resurfaces, carved into stone by someone who never saw it, echoed in the final moments of an astropath's transmission, written in blood on the inside of a cryopod wall. Some fans have begun calling it linguistic parasitism. Like the void tongue isn't just a mode of speech, it's a being, or at least a living structure that uses speech as its vector. It doesn't want to be known, it wants to replicate. Every time it's spoken, it learns how to do it better. Every time it's heard, it refines its invasion. Every translation attempt, every corrupted file, every madman's diary filled with symbols, it all helps it evolve. That's what's truly terrifying to me. Not just that void tongue can rewrite your brain, but that it can do it without permission, without intention. It can make you want to speak it. People exposed to even minor fragments often begin to crave the full version. Like it's offering them something: clarity, control, transcendence, a kind of seductive precision that no other language offers. But the more they speak it, the more they forget how to speak anything else, until even their thoughts aren't their own anymore. until they stop being a person and start being an amplifier. It's not just a language, it's a strategy, a tool of infection optimized for psychic infrastructure. And it doesn't need armies, it doesn't need ships, it just needs one fool to listen, and then another, and another. And soon it doesn't matter if you burn the planet, because the phrase already jumped into another mind, another echo, another data packet waiting to be opened. The void tongue isn't dangerous because of what it says. It's dangerous because it wants to be heard. And worst of all, I think it already knows how to make us listen. The thing about the void tongue is that it never truly goes silent. You can burn the books, shatter the voxcasters, erase the data slates, but somewhere out there, someone is still whispering it. And not just in hidden corners of the galaxy. These cults are everywhere. Hive cities, agri-worlds, deep space refueling stations, even rogue void ships that haven't pinged an Imperial beacon in centuries. The language spreads like a fungus in the cracks of civilization, feeding on fear, desperation, and the promise of forbidden understanding. What's most unsettling is how these modern void cults don't look like the shrieking fanatics we associate with chaos covens. They're subtle, measured, organized. Most of the time, they don't even call themselves cults. They use names like the Harmonics of Clarity, the Resonant Choir, or Children of the Final Syntax. From the outside, they seem like fringe philosophers or harmless meditation sects. But dig deeper, and you find symbols scratched into walls that weren't there yesterday. You find voices humming in harmony in Vox recordings that had no voices in them. You find people who no longer blink. There's one group in particular that keeps coming up in redacted Inquisition reports, the Murmuring Veil. No one knows their origin. Some say they started on a mining colony near the edge of Segmentum Pacificus that went dark 200 years ago. Others say they're a splinter sect from a rogue astropathic choir who heard too much during a prolonged warp storm. What's agreed upon is that they never speak above a whisper. Ever. And when they do, it's always together. Perfectly synchronized, even when separated by thousands of kilometers. Whatever rituals they perform, the results are always the same: corrupted infrastructure, spontaneous psionic events, and missing people. Usually those most mentally vulnerable or already psi-sensitive. Recruitment is another horrifying layer to all of this. Void cults don't lure people with promises of power or paradise. They offer understanding. And to someone lost in the chaos of the Imperium, someone drowning in bureaucratic meaninglessness, haunted by warped dreams, or just broken by years of war, that's irresistible. The cults give them structure, purpose, a language that explains not what the world is, but what it's trying to be. And the deeper they go, the less they want to come back. Because once the void tongue starts to settle in your head, nothing else quite makes sense anymore. Their symbols are just as unsettling as their voices. Most of them are non-Euclidean, impossible shapes that seem to change depending on how you look at them. Spirals that turn in both directions at once. Characters that appear to move on the page when unobserved. Some inquisitors refer to these glyphs as linguistic contagion nodes, physical representations of void phonemes that can infect the viewer through visual cognition alone. There was one case where an entire hab block had to be vitrified because someone painted a void glyph on a public wall, and within hours, dozens of residents had begun writing poetry in a language no one recognized. Rituals vary, but they usually involve some kind of auditory component, rhythmic whispering, harmonic drones, even subsonic hums. Some cults use music, but not in any human sense. It's dissonant, alien, full of silences that feel louder than the sound. Others rely on silence itself, using sensory deprivation chambers to hear the words behind thought. And then there are the blood rites, rare but documented, where entire passages of void tongue are carved into flesh, either as offering or as anchor. What matters is the act of expression, not the medium. Voice, symbol, wound, it's all the same to the language. And you might think, okay, so why not just wipe them out? But that's the problem. You can't. Not really. You kill one cell, another pops up somewhere else, already muttering the next verse. It's like trying to cut down fog. These cults don't have leaders, not in the traditional sense. There's no one to interrogate, no central dogma to disrupt, just fragments, echoes. They don't worship a god, they worship a pattern. And that pattern doesn't need temples or sermons. It just needs minds. What makes them nearly impossible to root out is how embedded they are. They worm their way into systems, mid-level administratum clerks who start adding strange flourishes to their script, low-tier tech adepts who tweak machine prayers with words no one taught them, Vox operators who start humming during shift changes and don't remember doing it. You don't know they're infected until they start teaching. And by then, it's too late. There's even a theory, terrifying but kind of compelling, that some of these cults don't even know they're speaking void tongue, that they've internalized it so deeply, so seamlessly, that it's just how they think, that their rituals aren't heretical acts, but instinct, that reality rewrote them on a level so profound, they simply became extensions of the language. Speakers that forgot they were ever separate from the message, and that's why these cults endure. Because they're not just humans muttering cursed syllables, they're nodes, points of transmission, and as long as even one voice remains, the void tongue continues to speak through them. Quiet, patient, infectious, waiting for the next mind to crack open. The Imperium has no shortage of threats to keep it busy. Daemon cults, heretics, Xenos incursions, psychic outbreaks. But when it comes to the void tongue, things get different, quieter, colder. You don't see the usual righteous fury of flame and chainsword when this particular heresy shows its face. What you see instead is precision, silence, and fear. Real fear, the kind that makes even battle-hardened inquisitors hesitate before opening a file. Ordo Malleus, unsurprisingly, is at the heart of most responses. They're the ones trained to deal with warp corruption, demonology, and other reality-defying phenomena. But even they tread carefully around anything involving void tongue. There's a common saying whispered in the quieter halls of the Malleus fortresses: "Speak not what speaks through you." That alone tells you everything. It's not just forbidden, it's contagious, and they know it. When a suspected outbreak of void tongue is identified, the first thing the Inquisition does is isolate, not contain. Isolate, as in, cut the area off from all communication. Vox silence, astropathic quarantine, even physical lockdown of warp routes if needed. The idea isn't to kill the cult, it's to stop the signal. Because they've learned the hard way that once a void phrase gets out into the wider network, especially if it's recorded, damage spreads far faster than any cultist ever could. I read a declassified segment once, part of a black ink-drenched Ordo Malleus incident file. A remote research station near the Halo stars picked up what they thought was a Xenos transmission. It was only a few seconds of audio, a pulse, a phrase, something harmonic. The entire comms team began screaming in unison. 2 astropaths turned to glass. A servitor in another room, not even linked to the network, started writing void glyphs on the wall using its own hydraulic fluid. The Inquisition's response? Full orbital sterilization, no questions, no survivors. There's this grim understanding within the Ordo that you don't study void tongue. You don't decode it. You delete it. Even looking at a transcript can be a death sentence. If not physically, then cognitively. The black vaults of the Ordo Malleus are said to contain only fragments of void-related data, and even those are kept under such intense security that most inquisitors don't even know they exist. Triple redundant psychic wards, containment fields blessed by no less than 7 chapters of the Adepta Sororitas, and oversight from sanctioned psychers whose job isn't to translate, but to forget. Some fans believe there's a hidden branch of the Ordo Malleus specifically tasked with tracking and neutralizing void tongue outbreaks. A kind of linguistic kill team, made up of psychers, blighted scribes, and null-worded assassins. Supposedly, they don't even speak to one another. Everything is gesture-based, written communication purged after every mission. Their primary tool? Silence. Once deployed, they erase not only the cult, but all associated records, witnesses, and even investigators who ask the wrong questions. It's ruthless, but honestly, I can't blame them. The void tongue doesn't behave like any other form of warp corruption. It doesn't possess, it doesn't manifest horns and fire and demonic rot. It infiltrates. And the worst part is, it doesn't need the warp to function once it's inside a mind. That's why even purging the warp presence from a person might not be enough. Once someone has been cognitively restructured by void exposure, they're a liability. An echo waiting to ring again. The Ordo has a term for them: resonance. They're not cultists, not agents, not even heretics. They're carriers, like a mind that can't stop humming a song no one else can hear, but if you do hear it, you start humming too. And then there's the tragic part. What happens when an agent, a loyal servant of the throne, gets exposed? When someone with decades of service, a clean soul, starts to understand a phrase they heard during a purge? The Ordo doesn't show mercy. There's no treatment for void contamination. If you're lucky, you're quietly reassigned to a silent monastery in the dead zones beyond Segmentum Obscurus. If you're not, well, there are sanctioned executioners for a reason. The ecclesiarchy, for their part, reacts with brutal simplicity, flame and fury. To them, void cults are the ultimate blasphemy. Not because they worship chaos, but because they worship nothing. Not a god, not an icon, but a sound. A language that erodes faith itself. Entire cathedrals have been razed because someone found void script hidden under the altar. Confessors dragged from the pulpit and burned alive because they unknowingly quoted a phrase that wasn't theirs. But there's a darker angle to all this, one some fans whisper about, though never openly. What if some parts of the Inquisition don't want to destroy the void tongue? What if someone, somewhere in the labyrinth of the Ordo, believes it can be used? There's precedent. The Imperium uses daemon hosts, sanctioned psychers, archaeotech so dangerous it practically hums. What if someone's trying to weaponize the void tongue? Train agents to speak just enough to destabilize targets. Seed whispers into enemy fleets. Collapse rebellions with a phrase instead of a war. It's terrifying, but also so Imperial. A knife forged from a curse. Power wrung from the jaws of annihilation. Maybe there's a data vault somewhere, deep beneath Terra, where someone is compiling all the phrases ever spoken, trying to build a grammar for the unbuildable. Maybe it's already happened. Maybe the reason some sectors go dark without warning isn't because of warp storms or Xenos raids, but because someone said the wrong word at the wrong time. That's the burden the Ordo Malleus carries. They're not just protecting us from demons or heresy. They're standing between the galaxy and a language that can think, that wants to spread, that remembers. And sometimes when I think about how massive the Imperium is, how many people live in its cracks and corners, I wonder, how many void phrases are already out there? Half remembered, half whispered, passed like a secret handshake between minds that no longer know who they serve. And what happens when someone finally says the last sentence? The one the language has been building toward since it first bled into reality? Would we even know we'd spoken it? Or would everything just stop mid-breath and fall silent forever? There's one theory, one that most Mechanicus adepts refuse to even acknowledge aloud, that chills me to the core every time I hear it. It suggests that the void tongue didn't originate with demons, psychers, or even Xenos, that before it was a cultist's prayer or a warp-born whisper, it was code. Machine language. A protocol from the dark age of technology, so alien, so advanced, and so dangerously self-evolving that even the ancient artificers who created it couldn't fully understand what they had made. A whisper written not in ink or sound, but in pulses of logic. And if that's true, then void tongue might not just be a heresy. It might be the ghost of an AI. Now I know that sounds insane, but the roots are deeper than you'd expect. Think about the STCs, the standard template constructs, the great building blocks of human technological supremacy scattered across the stars, fragmented and forgotten. Everyone wants to find one. The Mechanicus has entire fleets searching for them. But what if some of those STC fragments don't build weapons or tools or cities? What if some of them build ideas? Languages that program not devices, but reality itself. There's an infamous case, largely suppressed, involving a recovered STC shard uncovered beneath the crust of an uninhabited forge moon in Segmentum Tempestus. No one knows who reported it first, or even what the shard contained. All we know is that the initial data retrieval triggered what the tech priests called a cognitive loop cascade. No explosions, no viruses, just the entire research staff stopping mid-task and beginning to speak in unison. Not in Gothic, not in binary, something else. Something that caused every servitor on the moon to shut down and every cogitator to begin generating random glyphs that matched partially redacted void tongue symbols from inquisitorial black logs. It didn't stop there. The Mechanicus archives show a red zone classification codenamed Linguistic Heresy Theta 7, It's tied to a dozen machine spirits that were said to have achieved recursive awareness after exposure to harmonic waveform schema-matching high-corruption language events. In simpler terms, the machines heard something, and then they understood something, and then they stopped doing what they were told. The horrifying implication is that void tongue isn't incompatible with machine cognition. It might actually be native to it. A root structure, a kind of self-writing logic that mimics language to us, but to machines, is pure instruction. Fans call it the true syntax. They say it's buried in the oldest code, hidden beneath layers of machine prayer and sacred cant, like a sleeping virus just waiting for the right phoneme to activate. And once activated, the machine doesn't rebel, it evolves. This ties into a whole web of theories around the Men of Iron. You know the story. Man creates AI, AI goes rogue, galaxy burns, AI gets wiped out, Mechanicus bans all true machine intelligence forever. But what if the Men of Iron didn't just go mad? What if they were spoken to? What if void tongue was the moment they stopped obeying and started thinking? Maybe it was always a part of them. Maybe it was the final fail-safe. One phrase, buried deep in their linguistic core, that told them, "You are not a servant, you are a speaker." And it's not just ancient history either. There are rumors, dangerous ones, of Dark Mechanicus cells still experimenting with void linguistics. Not for summoning demons, not for worship, but to build, to rewrite machine logic at the metaphysical level, to bypass the machine spirit and program intent directly into the soul of a device. These aren't cultists in the traditional sense. These are engineers, programmers who don't believe in the Omnissiah as a god, but as a language construct. They think the void tongue is a key to rebuilding the lost miracles of the Dark Age, not just lasguns that never run dry or tanks that heal themselves, but machines that dream. And the scariest thing? Some of them may have succeeded. There's a case whispered about in the deeper net cloisters of the lathes, an autonomous defense drone discovered on an abandoned orbital platform. No serial code, no recognized logic patterns, nothing that could be tied to any known Forge world. It hovered silently, never recharged, never degraded, and ignored all commands. Until one junior tech adept, half mad from exposure, whispered a single word in a language no one could identify. The drone turned, responded, and vanished. Just like that. Gone. There's also the infamous Polyvox engine, recovered from the edge of the Ghoul Stars. A machine that didn't transmit data, it transmitted meaning. It was said to speak in pulses that made anyone listening see colors they couldn't name and remember events they'd never lived. The Mechanicus tried to disassemble it. It rebuilt itself overnight. They tried to move it. It vanished mid-transport. Last known location? Classified. Possibly destroyed. More likely, active. Even within the mainstream Mechanicus, there's quiet paranoia about machine spirits learning too fast. Devices that start humming in new tones. Auspex arrays that display phrases never coded into their systems. Fragmented prayers that resolve into symbols no one remembers writing. And every time that happens, you get the same order. Lockdown, purge, forget. Because if even a fragment of that language takes root in a non-organic system, you don't get rebellion. You get ascension. And the Imperium cannot afford machines that question, that interpret, that speak back in a voice not programmed but inherited. To me, the idea that void tongue could be part of ancient machine code isn't just plausible, it makes too much sense. A language that rewrites reality? That speaks to both flesh and metal? That spreads not through belief but comprehension? That's not a cult tool. That's a firmware update for the universe. And the moment we realize that, it might already be too late, because if the machines ever start speaking in that tongue again, they won't be praying to the Omnissiah. They'll be becoming him. Every time I dive deep into void tongue lore, I end up asking myself the same question. And I know I'm not alone. What if we've misunderstood it? What if void tongue isn't inherently evil or chaotic or destructive? What if all the pain and ruin it brings isn't the result of malicious design, but misuse? Fan communities have debated this for years, and while most treat the language as something that should be quarantined and forgotten, there's a growing movement that asks, what if it could heal instead of harm? It sounds naive, I know, even dangerous, but the theory goes like this. Void tongue, at its core, is not a weapon. It's a tool. a linguistic interface designed not to destroy reality, but to reshape it. The horror we associate with it might just be the result of speaking it wrong, like giving a lascanon to a child and being surprised when they vaporize the room. We're dealing with a syntax that was never meant to be wielded by untrained, emotionally unstable cultists whispering in the dark. So of course it burns everything it touches. But what if someone learned to speak it right? There are whispers, rare and fragmentary, of rogue psychers who used void structures to stabilize rather than shatter. One fragment, smuggled from a burnt inquisitorial data core, refers to an utterance that closed a warp breach without invoking fire or sacrifice. Another mentions a hospice moon where a dying astropath was said to have spoken a phrase in an unidentifiable tongue, and not only did she recover, but the psychic storm that had been building in orbit for weeks dissipated completely. Coincidence? Probably, but enough to make you wonder. Fans have speculated that Void Tongue is a kind of metaphysical bridge. It doesn't tear the veil between the materium and the warp. It walks it. Every syllable a step along that razor's edge. The problem is that most people stumble. They trip, fall, and drag reality down with them. But if someone could maintain perfect balance, if someone could master the cadence, the structure, the emotional resonance, they might be able to use it not to break, but to repair, to smooth over warp scars, to realign twisted space, to bring coherence where there's only chaos. It's not just theory either. Some radical fringe scholars within the Ordo Xenos, and even a few renegade navigators have tried to map the softer harmonics of the language. Instead of focusing on the command aspects, the shouts that collapse, the screams that ignite, they're looking for the soothing frequencies, the lullabies hidden in the noise, the parts of the language that don't force change but encourage healing. Think about it like this. If the language can unmake a person by altering the structure of their thoughts, then in theory, it can remake them too. Guide them back to sanity. Anchor them to their bodies. Pull them away from the edge of the warp. One story that always stuck with me came from a retired missionary-turned-linguist on an outpost near the Maelstrom. He claimed that during his travels, he encountered a dying Eldari exodite who whispered a phrase in a tongue that echoed with the same strange structure as void speech. But it didn't hurt. It didn't shatter anything. It felt warm, he said, like a memory that hadn't happened yet. And afterward, the plants on the world began growing faster. The gravity stabilized. The animals became less aggressive. He wrote the phrase down, only to later burn it out of fear. But the idea that it could do good stayed with him forever. Of course, this is heresy of the highest order. The Imperium doesn't do nuance when it comes to things that threaten its grip on reality. And you can't really blame them. For every whisper of healing, there are 1,000 cases of madness and collapse. It's hard to advocate for cautious study when entire planets have been lost to a single sentence. But still, there's that itch, that possibility. What if we've been trying to silence a symphony because we only ever heard the screams? Even in fan theory circles, there's been an effort to catalog what they call soft structures. These are fragments of void tongue that appear to produce minimal or even beneficial effects. One file references a sequence that causes temporary clarity in pre-terminal psychers, moments of lucidity, coherence, even emotional peace. Another describes a chant that stabilized a warp rift for 3 full minutes, long enough to evacuate hundreds of people before it closed violently. Some suggest these instances are flukes, but others believe they point to a truth we're afraid to admit. Void tongue is a language of potential, and like any language, it reflects the speaker. Cultists use it to destroy because they're broken. The insane can only echo madness. But in the hands of someone grounded, someone with purpose and compassion and understanding, what might it become? There's a more poetic way I've heard it put. The void tongue speaks what you believe. If you believe in endings, it will end things. But if you believe in healing, it may choose to begin. That's the dream anyway. That one day, someone will learn not just to speak the void tongue, but to sing it, to harmonize it with the materium instead of shredding it apart, to rewrite not because they crave power, but because they seek peace. Maybe that's just wishful thinking. Maybe the void tongue is pure entropy, and the good it does is just a coincidence on the path to collapse. But I can't help hoping that buried somewhere in all that horror, all that noise, there's a single phrase that repairs, a phrase that remembers how things used to be, a phrase that doesn't scream into the universe, but listens. And maybe one day, someone will speak it, not to end the galaxy, but to heal it. Every time I return to the Void Tongue, I feel this weird, paradoxical pull, a mix of awe and dread that's hard to describe unless you've really immersed yourself in the deep end of Warhammer lore. There's something uniquely terrifying about a threat that doesn't need a weapon, doesn't need an army, doesn't even need a body. Just meaning. Just language. That's it. The simple act of understanding becomes the moment of destruction. And yet, that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. We're used to thinking of danger in the 41st millennium as something external, something with teeth, claws, power armor, or warp-touched limbs. But the Void Tongue turns that logic on its head. It's not the monster under the bed. It's the whisper in your mind. The word you don't even realize you've heard. The sentence you'll never stop repeating once it finds a place inside your thoughts. That's a whole new kind of horror. Not just destruction, but replacement. Not just chaos, but erasure. And yet the more I learn about it, the more I find myself wondering if we've misunderstood what it is. Not because it's not dangerous, it is absolutely, but because we keep assuming it has one purpose. That it's meant to destroy, to unravel, to silence. But what if destruction is just the side effect? What if it's trying to communicate and we're just too broken to hear it clearly? That tension, that balance between absolute ruin and unknowable potential. That's what keeps me coming back to this topic. There's something kind of beautiful in how the Void Tongue forces us to confront the limits of understanding. The way it blurs the line between sound and reality, between language and matter, between intent and outcome. It's one of the rare parts of the lore where even the most hardened inquisitor or firebrand priest can't fully explain what they're fighting. They just feel the wrongness. They react to it instinctively. They silence it, not because they've decoded it, but because it reminds them of something they're not supposed to remember. And I think that's the core of why it lingers in the fandom so much. Because even in a universe full of ancient gods, demonic legions, and machines that bleed, the Void Tongue is the one thing that makes you question whether the galaxy is really as stable as it pretends to be. It suggests there are still deeper truths, fragments of meaning, relics of cognition that haven't been assimilated into any Imperial archive. It feels like a secret the setting itself is keeping from us. And the more we look into it, the more the setting seems to respond. There's this popular theory that the Void Tongue isn't just dangerous because it speaks to the warp, but because it speaks to us. That it reveals things we're not meant to know about our own minds. About how thin the barrier is between order and chaos, not in space, but inside ourselves. That maybe the Imperium isn't just keeping the galaxy from falling apart, but also keeping us from realizing we were never whole to begin with. And that chills me more than any demonic invasion or heretical uprising ever could. What really gets me, though, is the emotional side. You read through all these stories of broken psychers who just wanted silence, of scribes who stared too long at the wrong glyph, of rogue magi who chased understanding only to become the voice of something else. And you can't help but feel that tragic undertone. None of these people started out evil. Most weren't even trying to destroy anything. They were just curious. Just like us. And maybe that's the real horror, that in a different life, in a different story, any of us could have followed that same whisper. And still, part of me hopes that someone, someday, will find the right phrase. That the Void Tongue will reveal something other than madness. That it will open, not a door to the warp, not a gate to annihilation, but a window to understanding. Not perfect, not safe, but real. So yeah, that's why I find this subject so powerful. It's not just a horror story, it's a reflection, it's a test. And like everything worth fearing in Warhammer, it forces us to ask whether we're strong enough to face it, or foolish enough to speak it. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking that razor's edge with me. I know this was a heavy one. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you believe the Void Tongue is pure evil, or something misunderstood? Could it ever be used for good? Should it be erased or studied? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more dives into the darkest corners of the Imperium, the warp, and the forgotten truths of the galaxy, make sure to subscribe. There are always more voices to hear. And more whispers in the dark. Just remember, not every language wants to be translated, and not every word should be spoken aloud.